Alrighty, so I wanted to just pop on here for a little bit of history today. Some important information on the truth about America that most people either don't know or have forgotten. So anyhow, I figured this would be a good history lesson. This is a great little video, little animation. So a good one maybe for kids too. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and share this. Y'all can watch with me.
That's the last one. Quickly now. The king's men will soon be upon us. Faster if you can. Morning breaks.
Better hurry.
Just one more. Hurry, Goodman Carver. On to Holland. On to Holland.
What you say?
We're ready to sail. Bring in the anchor.
I'm afraid that I cannot do.
May I see your license to leave the country?
No, we have no license.
No license. I see.
Pay attention
Your
to those
belongings are now the
licenses.
property of England and King James. Arrest them. All we wanted to do was to go somewhere and worship God in peace. Worship God like a good Englishman, and you'll get your peace. Rotten Puritan!
Man, hey, maybe that guy wasn't a Christian.
The conditions are very hard. The boat is crowded, and the winter is already upon us. But we suffer what we must. For only a new world can offer what we seek. Pure religious freedom. And so we sail on. We pilgrims sail on to America. Thank you, William. You are kind. No, I'm selfish, Goodman Carver. I need your help.
Let go of me. You have no right. Give me that thing.
Gentlemen, please.
He's trying to throw our Jack overboard. Captain says all useless weight has got to go. Useless? It's to help us build our church. All the more reason to get rid of it, you worthless separatist.
Quiet now. Quiet, I say. Go your way now.
Stinking pilgrims. You'll get us all killed, you will. It's your fault, you know. Every time you pilgrims pray or sing, God punishes the whole ship. The mainmast is unstable. I'll have to turn back. Turn back?
We can't turn back, Captain Standish.
I'm in charge of your survival. We're going back to England.
Where will we live? We have no homes in England. We have no friends. We gave up everything to be here.
You should have thought of that before you left the King's Church.
It makes no difference to you whether we get to America or not. You were only going there to get rich. But we were going to live.
Let go of my sleeve.
Please, at least try and fix it.
The entire deck has to be lifted, Mr. Bradford. It takes more than hammer and nails.
Would this help?
Useless, huh? Going to get us all killed, huh?
Thank you, Captain Standish.
You know, Bradford, I made more money in 1 year as a soldier of fortune than I could ever make in America. I'm not going to get rich. I'm going because I want to. Land ho!
Land. We pilgrims have all signed. Who will be next?
We don't have to sign no agreement. Why should we?
For your own protection.
Protection from what?
There are rumors. Some swear they will live here without law and order once on land.
I didn't hear any rumors. You hear any rumors?
Come, gentlemen. We mustn't set foot upon land until we are all agreed.
I didn't come all this way to be ruled by pilgrims. I'm going ashore. Who's coming with me?
Wait! You don't understand what's written here.
Out of my way.
We will make our own laws, elect our own leaders.
Who will?
You will. Free government, men. That means nothing happens without your consent. Who will sign?
No son of England has ever had this chance, boys. You better take it while you can.
Then it is agreed. We will elect a governor who will serve for 1 year. I nominate John Carver.
I second the nomination.
Any other nominations? All in favor say aye. 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 Congratulations, Governor Carver.
This is the beginning of common law in America.
We've got to hurry and find a place to build. Snow's about to fly.
What do you think, Captain? Is this a good place?
Water supply is good. Be hard to keep the Indians out, though.
That's all right. I hope to make friends with the Indians.
You what?
They could be the key to our survival.
Look, William, I've been sent to teach you pilgrims how to fight Indians, not to have tea with them.
They know the land. They can help us get through the winter.
If I'd known you had such stupid ideas, I'd never have signed no agreement.
That's why I kept it to myself.
There! Where they come? In the trees! Roger, sir! Quickly!
Fire in the air!
to make friends with the Indians. They could be the key to our survival.
We'll just have to find friendlier Indians. We call our colony Plymouth. We commenced building on Christmas Day, but the winter has been harsh, and we lack time to build a proper home. Hunger and disease have also run their evil course. More than half of the 100 souls who came to America have died. And of those who struggle on, there are at times only 6 or 7 strong enough to bury the dead. I, too, was brought to the brink of death. But by the grace of God and the kindness of friends, I have survived. I keep watching for Indians to come, hoping to learn their secrets of survival, but none endeavor to show themselves. How shall we survive without some knowledge of this land?
Bradford! Bradford!
Everyone stay calm. If we wait long enough, he'll leave. What are you doing? Where are you going? Crazy pilgrims.
Tell Chief Massasoit, yes, we will meet him. We want peace with Wampanoag people.
Good. Massasoit, come.
Samoset, is there anyone who speaks more English than you?
More English?
Speaks better English.
Ah, one better. Squanto.
Will you bring him? Bring Squanto here.
Yes. Bring better English.
Try this one on.
I don't want to wear a helmet.
You have no choice. You don't want the Indians to think we're defenseless, do you?
No, but I don't want them to think I'm headless either.
Captain Standish, is this really necessary?
I want them Indians to know that we're well equipped if they choose to start a fight.
But
I'll hear nothing of it, William. This time, I must insist.
welcome. You are Squanto. My name, Bradford. William Bradford. Me, small man. Not big man. Governor Carver, big man. Governor means...
A mouth is good enough for speaking, William Bradford. Squanto understand your words without hands moving.
Good. Good.
are happy. We know that the Wampanoag will be our friends forever.
Nawani yu wama. Nawati yao man pish nitami set to wog machine.
Good. All that is left then is to sign.
Boy, they
Massasoit
sure
has
did a
no
lot of stuff
signature,
by
John Cub.
contract.
Potato.
I wonder if that has something to do with common law.
But these gifts are for you. They are better than English letters. You plant too deep.
So the birds won't find them.
Sun also won't find them. Too deep. Pilgrims are not planting people.
No, I'm afraid not.
Bradford needs help. Squanto needs help too. I grow big in this place, Bradford. Before your houses, my people, Patuxet, live here.
Why did they leave?
Did not leave. Died. All dead. Long time ago, I see white man for first time. They teach me English words. I spoke for them to the Patuxet, the Wampanoag, other people too. One day, a white man took me, tied me, put me on ship. My mother cried. But they take me. I went over big water to Bradford home.
You went to England?
England, Spain, other places too. Later, I came back to this place. My people were gone. All died.
War?
War with sickness, William. White man's sickness. It killed my people. Massasoit was good to me. He said, live with my people. I did. But his people are not my people. His land is not my land. This is my land. This is my home. I live with you now, William Bradford?
Yes. Yes. For as long as you like, Squanto. Yes.
Give me a hand and I'll give you a hand.
Alrighty, I'm gonna pass on the Disney music here.
Four hands can do so. Only one is no.
Tried, William.
Yeah.
Then four.
Okay.
William.
John! Do you need help, John? John!
No good, William. This man means to die. I tried, William.
Ah, William. You are kind.
We need you, John.
God has heard our prayers, William. Squanto will help you now.
But Squanto cannot govern these people.
No. But you can. Death is nothing, Will. But this colony, what it represents, shall live forever. I'm glad we came, Will.
Let us put the matter to a vote then. All in favour? Aye. Opposed? I present to you Plymouth's new governor, William Bradford.
I am honored, deeply honored. With your permission, I will make my first proposal as governor. And that is this: that every fall at the close of harvest, we set aside a day of feasting. Not a feast of gluttons or of fools, but a feast of thanksgiving. To honor God, for surely without him, we would not be.
On July 22nd, 1620, English separatists living in Holland are boarding a ship at Delfshaven to begin their journey across the Atlantic to America. One of the separatists, William Bradford, remembered the day, stating,
I'm on the
"So they
William
left the goodly
Bradford
and
kick
pleasant
today.
city, which had been their resting place near 12 years, but they knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on those things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits." We will zoom into England and the adjacent area. On this map, we can see Ireland, Wales, England, and Holland. It's 1606. On the bottom right, the monarch is shown, King James I. The date is below the monarch. For most of this program, we will be using months and years. However, the English are using the Julian or Old Style calendar at this time, which is different than the Gregorian or New Style calendar used in much of the continent of Europe. The Gregorian New Style calendar is what we use today. There is a difference of 10 days between these calendars. For instance, June 1st, 1606 in England would actually be June 10, 1606 in France, Spain, and much of Europe. I will list both calendar dates when a specific date is used. Otherwise, a single month or year will be used. In 1606, there is a commotion in the region of Nottinghamshire. Several ministers there are opposing King James' pressure to adhere to the Church of England. Some ministers in the Nottinghamshire area claim they should separate from the Church of England. King James at London is the head of the Church of England, so the claim to separate from the Church of England is politically dangerous because it insinuates contempt for the monarchy. We will zoom into the Nottinghamshire region. Nottingham is here. Sherwood Forest is here. The village of Scrooby is here. At Scrooby, William Brewster is active in the organization of a separatist church. John Robinson is the separatist minister there. Separatists are a unique community, and it's important to understand how they fit into the religious landscape of 17th century England. In England at this time, the king is the head of the official state religion, the Church of England. So religious affiliation automatically becomes political because the king is the head of the Church of England. This is why Roman Catholics would be held in great suspicion in England at this time, because the head of the Catholic Church is the Pope in Rome, not the king in England. There is an opposing faction within the Church of England, the Puritans. The Puritans want to purify the Church of England, but they remain within the Church of England. Separatists, on the other hand, want a complete separation from the Church of England. So separatists claiming to break away from the Church of England could be interpreted as wanting to break away from the king himself. Therefore, it's easy to see why the separatists will be targeted by the state. In Scrooby, a teenager is attending the separatist church. He is William Bradford. In London that same year, King James establishes the Virginia Company. We will zoom out to
Because
the
they want
transatlantic
Jesus
world.
to be their king.
1607,
They
the
wanted to
Virginia Company
separate.
founds Jamestown. In that same year, the separatist community in Scrooby formally breaks from the Church of England. We will zoom back to England. So in 1607, there is a declared independent church in Scrooby. Separatist churches are doing something unique. Instead of a top-down hierarchy with bishops and archbishops, the clergy are only active in the local congregation. The laity are active in the governance of a separatist church, and the congregation elects the minister. Thus, Scrooby's congregation is electing its own clergy and acting independently in terms of religion from the king. These activities will not go unnoticed. Shortly thereafter in Scrooby, members of Brewster's separatist congregation are imprisoned. The congregation realizes it may be time to leave England. William Bradford described the allure of Holland, the nation located just across the waters, noting, by a joint consent they resolved to go into the Low Countries, where they heard there was freedom of religion for all men. Separatists in the previous generation had fled to Amsterdam in the 1590s, so such a transplant had a precedence. We will zoom back into England. The congregation in Scrooby plans to leave England for Holland. The refugees make for the coast, where transportation is waiting. However, in Lincolnshire, they are betrayed by the shipping crew that is to take them to Holland. Money and property is stolen, and the church members who had been robbed are then jailed. This betrayal, robbery, and jailing occurs at a town called Boston. But the separatists will make another attempt for Holland. 1608, the congregation prepares to board ships in the waters between Hull and Grimsby. But while the ship is being loaded in Hull, authorities are seen approaching, and ship officers panic. Families are separated, as many of the women are not on the ship at departure. Nevertheless, the first round of refugees, after being blown by storms near the coast of Norway, make it to Amsterdam. Though initially separated, more rounds of settlers from Scrooby will come over in the following months. We will zoom into Holland. The separatists are initially in Amsterdam. In 1609, the English immigrants make their way from Amsterdam to Leiden. We will zoom into Leiden. In Leiden, the separatists form a community near Peter's Kirk. William Bradford called Leiden a fair and beautiful city. The Leiden congregation is under the leadership of the minister John Robinson and the lay elder William Brewster, both of whom had led the congregation in Scrooby. So in Leiden, the English separatists have formed a near self-governing community in which their congregation is managed by an elected minister and lay elder, and they see no point in the king having a role in church governance. We will zoom out to the wider region. 1611, various scholars at Westminster, Oxford, and Cambridge have completed a translation of the Bible into English. King James had sponsored the project, thus this version is still known today as the King James Bible. 1613, across the waters in Leiden, William Bradford, now in his 20s, marries Dorothy May. Fall 1617, in London, the separatists have Robert Cushman and John Carver in communication with His Majesty's Council for Virginia, otherwise known as the Virginia Company, in order to secure a land patent for a colony in America.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it, just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44,
A land
complete AI
patent, he
creation
said.
platform. Describe what you want.
Meanwhile,
To establish a land patent. That's important. Keep that in mind.
By 1618, back in Leiden, William Brewster, Edward Winslow, and Thomas Brewer are operating a printing press. This press prints works opposing the Church of England. But there are signs that the separatists may need to leave Holland. There's the looming prospect of war between Holland and Spain, which might turn a city like Leiden into a war zone. In addition, the English have been in Holland for long enough that a new generation of children have been born and raised. There are fears that the youth are losing their English heritage. But with the congregation at odds with King James, a return to England is not an option. But there is another option. We will zoom out. The alternative is to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and plant a new life in America. And this is why the separatists have agents in London speaking with the Virginia Company. While a voyage across the ocean is very dangerous, Bradford provides an insight into its appeal, a mission of advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. But where to go across the Atlantic? The Dutch are active in Guyana in South America. This region would provide a warm climate. However, Spain is dominant in the wider region, and if the colony became profitable, Spain would surely overthrow it. Also, Europeans had enough experience with exploration to know that regions with year-long warm weather also fostered a higher rate of disease. But what about Virginia? Jamestown was already settled. So on the one hand, the English are already there. On the other hand, the English are already there. A separatist community in or near Jamestown might find itself right back under the thumb of King James and the Church of England. The question of where to go will take time to sort out. The separatists will need to acquire a patent from an organization like the Virginia Company in order to have a legal title to land. In the meantime, there is a sign from above. November 6, 1618. A comet shows in the heavens, visible for multiple weeks. A community like the separatists, who understood all workings as the product of God's sovereignty, would most certainly take such a wonder as a sign. In May 1619, in London, Robert Cushman, the official in communication with the Virginia Company, reports ill tidings from Virginia. A recent voyage to Virginia had ended in disaster, with most passengers dead from sickness and want of fresh water. At this time, King James is aware of the separatist press in Leiden. Leiden separatist materials are being sold in England. Agents from England work with the University of Leiden to seize the Leiden printing press. Thomas Brewer is arrested. However, William Brewster escapes arrest. Though in a different country, Holland may not be as safe as the separatists had hoped. It is time to leave. By June 1619, in London, Robert Cushman has secured a patent from the Virginia Company for the Leiden separatists. This patent provides a legal land title for a plantation in America. In the early 17th century, a plantation means a colony, which is different from the connotation of a 19th century cash crop plantation. And in a separatist context, the idea of a plantation takes on a religious meaning of planting a church. From this point forward, we will refer to the separatists who have decided to leave for America as pilgrims in order to distinguish this group from other separatists who will remain in Europe. The news of the late and disastrous voyage from the Virginia Company causes concern. However, another agency comes into the Pilgrims' business about this time. It is the Merchant Adventurers, another London agency. Thomas Weston, the adventurers' agent from London, met with the Leiden congregation. Weston convinces the separatists to go with him and not the Virginia Company. The adventurers offer to create a joint stock company with the Pilgrims. The company will finance much of the voyage in exchange for revenue returns from the future colony. Weston's adventurers hold a patent for the area at the mouth of the Hudson River, an area that could yield significant fishing profits. The Hudson River area is a good location for the Pilgrims. It is close enough to Jamestown that they might receive the king's protection if need be, but far enough from Jamestown that they will retain their religious freedom. The company's initial terms require the Pilgrims to work 5 days each week for the company, and the Pilgrims in turn would have 2 days for personal gain and worship.
I think about Grammarly and how it's helped me prepare not just briefs, but really scripts that allow me.
Profits and possessions would then be divided among all shareholders after 7 years. In England, John Carver and Robert Cushman finalized the agreement and provisioned the voyage. By next June 1620, finalized terms come back from England to Leiden. In the new terms, the Pilgrims are required to work all 7 days for the company. There is nothing in the new terms about free time for worship and personal business. There, Pastor Robinson defends his flock. He writes back to Carver in England, noting, "How much unfit that you and your likes must serve a new apprenticeship of 7 years and not a day's freedom from task." The Pilgrims still need ships. They acquire the Speedwell in Holland. The ship is at Delfshaven. A second ship, the Mayflower, has been purchased in England. The Speedwell will transport the Pilgrims from Holland to Southampton, England. At Southampton, the Speedwell Pilgrims will rendezvous with the Mayflower. The intention is that the Speedwell will be used for fishing in America. The Pilgrims depart Leiden for Delfshaven, where the Speedwell is anchored. July 22nd, 1620, the Pilgrims board the Speedwell and leave Delfshaven for Southampton. So at Delfshaven, goodbyes are said between the Pilgrims and their family and friends remaining in Holland. The Pilgrims depart Holland, having spent 12 years in that country. Meanwhile, the Mayflower proceeds from the mouth of the Thames River to Southampton. Both ships have courses set for Southampton. We will zoom in to the Mayflower. The Mayflower is also carrying English passengers bound for America. The Mayflower is 100 feet long. The ship, managed by a few dozen crewmen, is captained by Christopher Jones. We will zoom out. July 26th, the Speedwell and the Mayflower are in Southampton, England. Passengers from England and Holland are now together. Let's take a transatlantic view. The trip is some 3,400 miles from Southampton, England, to the mouth of the Hudson River. It is still summer, and an efficient journey with cooperating winds could get them to the Hudson River before winter. We will zoom into Southampton. Southampton today has modern docks lining the water. I will fill those areas in with natural earth so the landscape is more similar to that of the 17th century. St. Michael's Church here began in the 11th century. There is a quay on the side of town where ships load and unload, so I've placed the Mayflower and the Speedwell there. William Brewster, the man who had escaped arrest for his publications in Leiden, is reunited with the Leiden congregation in Southampton. Some other persons here now assembled are Miles Standish, a professional soldier, and Stephen Hopkins, who had already been to Jamestown. Thomas Weston of the Adventurers has come to Southampton from London to solve the remaining disputes within the company's terms. The remaining disputes have to do with how houses and lands will be divided. While these issues are being worked out, the Pilgrims are required to sell butter stores to pay pressing expenses. But there's another issue. The Adventurers, a company with business considerations sometimes different than the Pilgrims, has added passengers to the voyage who are not separatists. The Pilgrims will refer to those passengers who are not separatists as strangers. Nevertheless, on August 5th, the passengers are on board. The Mayflower and the Speedwell set sail from Southampton for the voyage. We will zoom out to the English Channel. The Mayflower and the Speedwell move west through the channel. The ships are nearing the open sea, but there is trouble with the Speedwell. The ship is leaking. They must turn back. The Mayflower and Speedwell route back to land. They set course for Dartmouth. At Dartmouth, Bradford says they lost time and fair wind. It's now late August. The Speedwell has been inspected and mended. The ships set sail again. They clear the channel. But after they progress some 100 leagues, or about 300 miles, the Speedwell is again awash with seawater. The ships once again turn back to land, this time to Plymouth. It is decided here that the Speedwell is not seaworthy, and she will not be part of the voyage. The Speedwell returns to the mouth of the Thames River with various passengers who have lost hope in the voyage. The stores and remaining passengers from the Speedwell must now be packed onto the Mayflower. Only the Mayflower will continue to America. It has been a full month since the Mayflower first departed Southampton, and the ship has only progressed 120 miles to Plymouth. The long delay in England has already reduced food stores on the Mayflower, and some question whether the journey is doomed. However, the remaining passengers press on. September 6, 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth. William Bradford noted, "These troubles being blown over, and now all being compact together in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which continued divers days together, which was some encouragement unto them." The Mayflower is off. We will zoom into the ship. There are 102 passengers on the Mayflower. The passengers will share cramped quarters between the decks, a dark, narrow space within the ship. In the early part of the voyage, the winds are favorable.
Here at Renewal by Andersen, you can replace your windows and doors right now.
However, by October 1620, crosswinds and storms rocked the ship. A large beam at midships cracks. The ship's carpenter, using an iron screw brought by the passengers, is able to repair the ship. Powerful opposing winds force the crew to pull up or furl their sails. With the sails tied up, the ship will now not be thrown around by the winds. The Mayflower then sits at a standstill in the ocean until the winds die down. There are some storms so strong the ship must sit furled for days at a time. Only when more favorable winds blow will the sails be released or unfurled. Then the ship can progress westward. Over the course of the journey, the Mayflower manages about 2 miles an hour over the waters. One crew member is particularly harsh with the passenger. He is the one crew member who dies at sea. The voyage includes a tragedy and a miracle. A young servant boy, William Button, dies. He is the sole passenger to die during the voyage. But where one is lost, another is provided. Elizabeth Hopkins, wife of Stephen Hopkins, gives birth to a son. She names him Oceanus. November 1620. Something in the air feels different. November 8th comes and goes. Night falls. Dawn, November 9. Edward Winslow and William Bradford note, by break of day we spied land which we deemed to be Cape Cod, and soon afterward it proved. And the appearance of it much comforted us, especially seeing so goodly a land, and wooded to the brink of the sea, it caused us to rejoice together and praise God that he had given us once again to see land. The Mayflower has crossed the ocean. The passengers had spent 65 days at sea. We will zoom out. The Mayflower is at Cape Cod. The mouth of the Hudson River is here. So the Mayflower is about 230 miles northeast of their legal patent title at the Hudson River. Cape Cod, as its name implies, has great potential for the colony. The fishing resources are well known in Europe by 1620. However, Cape Cod is not technically within their legal rights to settle. Legally, they need to push on to the mouth of the Hudson. The crew is, from their perspective, in a new world, and the coastlines, shore depths, and distances are not known to them. The Mayflower crew will attempt to steer the ship to the south-southwest to find the Hudson River. On the one hand, the Mayflower crew wants to remain within sight of land as they are traveling along an unknown coastline. On the other hand, being near land presents shallow water hazards for the ship. But the crewmen detect shoals or sandbars in the waters below Cape Cod. Shoals are submerged sandbars that are very dangerous to ships. The ships can become grounded, which can damage or even wreck a ship. Bradford says the Mayflower fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers. It's November and night is coming fast. With darkness falling on November 9th, it is determined that the trip to the Hudson River is too dangerous. The Mayflower circles back around, facing north. We will zoom back out. The ship will return to Cape Cod, an area outside their patent territory. With the landing now to occur outside their legal area, there is the possibility of mutiny. Bradford noted that among the passengers there were some not well affected to unite in concord, but gave some appearance of faction, and that discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall from them in the ship. The passengers, in order to maintain social order, will need to create a document that outlines a social contract before the ship makes landing. Bradford recalled it was thought good there should be an association and agreement that we should combine together in one body. Night falls on November 9th. It's now the morning of November 10th. The Mayflower is moving north, parallel to Cape Cod. The captain, Christopher Jones, wants to get inside the bay. While the ship pushes north, the passengers are forming their social compact. There are strangers and pilgrims aboard the ship, but the separatists on board are large enough to form a unified body. They strengthen around a leader, John Carver. As darkness falls, the Mayflower is rounding the north edge of Cape Cod. The bay will provide harbor for the ship. Night falls. It's morning, November 11, 1620. The Mayflower maneuvers inside Cape Cod's interior near modern Provincetown, Massachusetts. Bradford and Winslow recorded, "We came to an anchor in the bay, which is a good harbor and pleasant bay, circled round, except in the entrance, which is about 4 miles over from land to land, compassed about to the very sea, with oaks, pines, juniper, sassafras, and other sweet woods. It is a harbor wherein 1,000 sail of ships may safely ride. There we relied ourselves with food and water and refreshed our people." The adult men on board signed the compact which had just been written. The Mayflower Compact reads, "In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have here under subscribed our names, Cape Cod, 11 of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland and Scotland, A.D. 1620. The Pilgrims had crossed the ocean. Bradford noted, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. Yet now anchored off an unknown land, thousands of miles from their mother country, the Pilgrims determined to create a new civilization.
Great. The new GoDaddy Arrow has AI marketing tools to help small
day that this video is going to be an introduction to the history of English law. We will explore what we're talking about. We'll explore the importance. We'll talk about the complexity. We'll outline the scope of this series of videos and then talk about some citations and further reading at the end. And really, this is going to be an introduction that is released today in the sort of middle of October in preparation for a whole series of these lessons coming out weekly in the new year, starting in January 2025. Just as with all of the other videos that are already currently being released, if you are a level 2 or above member, you have access to these lessons as and when they are put onto the YouTube channel, regardless of whether or not they release later on in the year or not. So that's essentially the introductions out of the way. This lesson specifically, as I said, is going to outline the scope of this set of lessons while taking an introduction to the subject of English legal history. And
Okay, real quick, I wanted to point out one thing that was said about the Mayflower Compact. So, and these are just the facts. So here it says the original document has been lost, but 3 versions exist from the 17th century, printed in whatever this is. So anyhow, because I'm having a hard time believing that they called King James the sovereign Lord. That, I don't know, man. I'm having a hard time buying that one. Anyhow, just wanted to point that out. Back to this is about paying attention to what common law is, what it's all about, where it came from. This is important for Americans to understand.
then we will talk about some of the main readings and further readings for this series of videos as well.
And hopefully
So
you'll see God's hand
let's
in it
begin
too.
with this, and let's think about the English legal system as from a historical perspective, and think about the history of English legal system, the English legal system, or the history of English legal history. This is sort of like a meta-historical study, if you will. Generally speaking, most historically significant parts of English law as we know it today, in terms of their historical development, develops out of the common law, okay, or at least forms as a part of the common law. This is why, for the most part, or at least for the first half of this series of lessons, when we look at this really early history, we will be concerning ourselves almost exclusively with the development of the common law and the history of the common law as it develops through time. We will get on to talking about the increased role of Parliament, the nature of the Constitution, and the various different constitutional changes that starts to develop as well as we get closer and closer to the present day. This is going to be a history of English law starting really from the Roman period all the way through the Anglo-Saxons and Norman conquest, Henry II, all the way through to the Tudors, all the way past the Tudors to the Stuarts and the constitutional revolution that takes place there, all the way to the present day. We're going to finish, in fact, this series of lessons by talking about
Yeah, we're not
constitutional
going through
reform
all of
that
that.
has
We're
taken
just
place since
we
1997
want to
under
get
the
into
Labour governments of
origins
Tony
of
Blair and
common
Gordon
law.
Brown.
That's all we're
We might
doing
even go a
over
bit
here.
further and talk about Brexit and sort of finish at that point. We'll have to eventually stop, because otherwise we'll just it goes from being a history of English law to just a news channel about what's happening in at the current present time in legal history. So it's going to be a long series of lessons. We're going to be charting what is a good 1,000+ year history, and generally speaking, the history of the common law has a particularly long, rich, and complex development. Okay, its development begins officially, where we can say, right, the common law begins in the sort of Angevin Empire of Henry II, but its procedures and the sort of antecedents of the common law can date as far back as the Roman traditions of the Roman law, when the Romans had taken control of Britain. So we are really talking about quite a long development in terms of its history. The common law itself, if you just want to have a definition for those of us who are beginning this lesson without thinking about constitutional law or thinking about public and administrative law.
Oh my goodness, I love this question.
It's simple. We use data rail.
At the moment, the common law is just the body of law that has evolved through judicial decisions, through legal precedents. And this is obviously in contrast to statute law, where we have a piece of legislation that is created. We will get, as time goes on, to looking at statute law in more detail, because essentially as the common law develops, we sort of see quite a strong emphasis on the common law system and the way in which the common law develops over time. But then as time goes on and a number of important events takes place, the Tudor dynasty is a very important event which takes place. Specifically, people like Henry VIII were quite important. But then most importantly, we have, of course, the reign of the Stuart dynasty with James I and Charles I. And we have the sort of overthrowing of monarchy, the establishment of a protectorate, and then we have the restoration of the monarchy, all of which culminating in the growth and power of importance of Parliament. And of course, Parliament begins to grow as time goes on. And then we start to develop from there constitutional principles, even though we are going to be talking about Magna Carta from 1215, and we'll talk about other things that develop in terms of our constitutional history. The way in which we speak about the Constitution as we know it today starts to develop after the sort of Stuart period, if you will. There are points that happened before, but this is the sort of point at which we see the Glorious Revolution. We see the sovereignty of Parliament be well and truly codified. And then we start to see more development as time goes on. And I'll talk about that in a minute when we look at the structure of this series of lessons. One of the reasons why the history of English law is so important, is such an important thing to study, is not just because of your understanding of the English legal system as it exists in England and Wales today, which is, I think, a very important thing for you to study. If you're somebody who wants to practice law in the future, there are sort of two modules that I would always recommend anybody do at university studying law. That aren't directly to do with the sort of doctrinal legal principles in commercial law or company law or family law or whatever. And that's firstly the history of English law. So you see a
Doctrinally
development of this sort of historical development from of the system that you are studying and living in at the moment, but also jurisprudence. I think legal philosophy or legal theory is also quite important. But not just because of that is the reason why the history of the English legal system is important, but so too is it important because it forms the foundation of legal systems in a great number of countries. One of the things that we did as part of the British Empire was export a number of these principles, export the ideas of precedent and the common law and all of these different things. And that's why some of the legal systems that we see in the Commonwealth or former colonies of the British Empire have similar traditions and have similar systems. And so these ideas aren't just unique to England and Wales. They are expanded and extended across the entire world. And so that's something that also needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about the history of the English legal system. So we know that there are various different sort of inflection points in the history of the English legal system that really does lead to a quite major radical development in one direction or another. So you have, of course, the Roman occupation of Britain. You then have the Anglo-Saxon legal system that begins to develop, and then a huge inflection point is the Norman conquests in 1066, which sees the development of a legal system into something known as feudalism. You also see things like the development of the common law under Henry II. You obviously have things like the Magna Carta. You then have things like the Tudor dynasty, like I've said, and then the Glorious Revolution. All of these are sort of major inflection points that sees the legal system shift and go towards one way or another. Okay. So at the time, before the Norman conquest of 1066, you see that the legal landscape was very fragmented. You have what was known as the heptarchy in the Anglo-Saxon period. So a number of quite small systems of governance among Britain, including Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia. You also had Danelaw as the result of the Viking conquests of Britain at various different stages. And within all of this sort of melting pot of different legal landscapes, we see the development of customary laws, which would vary from region to region and in terms of their application.
Hello, my name is Adam Ferrari, the Chief Executive Officer of Phoenix Energy. I look forward to you joining.
So this is really what we're not even starting at this point here. We're not even starting at the Anglo-Saxon period. We're going to start even further than that by talking about the influence of the Roman law and the influence of the Romans being a part of Britain and a part of our history. So that is the first of the two pre-Norman conquest legal traditions that we're going to explore. And then the second of those is the Anglo-Saxon legal system, the legal system of people like Alfred the Great, people like Ethelred the Unready, people
The
like, for example, King
Anglo-Saxon
Canute
legal system is the birth of American
explored.
law.
Edward the Elder and all of these different individuals. And this is really even before England as we know it today even existed. Okay, you would argue that it was King Ethelstan that was the person who formally unified the heptarchy into the English into the system of the country of England that we sort of know of today. So prior to that, we're not even talking about England at this point. Okay, and that just goes to show the way in which law develops over time. That in this kind of way, the law is older than the country in which the law comes from, if you will, or governs. So that's a quite interesting little unique feature of the English legal system. We'll then talk about the Norman conquest, the development of feudalism, and the sort of the ways in which the legal system existed at that point, the criminal law, property law, the way in which inheritance operated at that point. And then we will talk about the development of the common law under the reign of Henry II. So at this point, we're in the sort of 1150 to 1189. And then we will talk about 1215 and the Magna Carta, the sort of influence of Magna Carta, what Magna Carta signifies, okay, in terms of the relationship between royalty and the rest of us, essentially, in the nobility. And then we will move on to sort of the more broader themes. So there's quite a big gap here that we're talking about up to 1500s, which we will talk about in sort of broad strokes: the development and expansion of the common law into the 16th century, the creation of the Court of Chancery, the sort of dual structure of legal adjudication with a sort of court of equity on the one hand and the legal system on the other, the ways in which equity starts to develop as well over time. There'll be some nice linkages from that to our equity and trust lessons that we've done in the past. And then we're going to start to think about Parliament. Okay, so throughout this entire time, okay, Parliament is sort of under the in the background developing. Okay, Parliament develops from around the 1300s onwards, if you will, and we only really see the major growth of Parliament sort of in response to and in relation to the Tudor dynasty, and then specifically in relation to the Stuarts, specifically Charles I and the relationship, and James I, in fact, the relationship between those two monarchs and Parliament. We'll talk about the modern common law. We'll talk about the Judicature Acts and the fusion debates between equity and the legal system. We'll talk about a little bit internationally, talking about the colonial influence and the exporting of the English legal system. And then we will finally finish on looking at the common law as we know it today. Like I said, going all the way up to the development of the Constitution up to the end of the new Labour government in sort of 2010. So that's really as high as we're going. And so with this in mind, let's think about the citations of further reading. So there are a couple of really good sources that we can think about here. You've got Jay Baker's Introduction to English Legal History from 2019, one of the best in terms of your sort of early history, sort of medieval common law studies is The Formation of the English Common Law from Jay Hudson. And then you also have one of the main citations for this set of reading, which is a recent book that came out in 2020 titled Law, Liberty and the Constitution, A Brief History of the Common Law. Now, what's very interesting here is the H. Potter, who is the author of this book. The H actually stands for Harry. So you're if you choose this particular piece of study, you will be studying English legal history from someone called Harry Potter, which I think is particularly good. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I see everybody in the next lesson for when we talk about some of the Roman traditions and the development of the Roman law in English legal history. So bye for now.
Have you ever wanted to see your home from space? With this free satellite Earth Maps tool, you can zoom right down.
Hello everybody and welcome back to our studies in the history of English law. This lesson is going to talk about the first of the two sort of pre-Norman conquest areas that I want to explore when thinking about the history of English law. The first of these is, of course, looking at the influence of Roman Britain and the Roman law and what the Romans brought essentially to the English legal system. And then the second of those will concern itself with the development of law under the Anglo-Saxons and through the Anglo-Saxon period. So this lesson is going to be the first of, I think, 3 or 4 lessons looking at the history of the English legal system, beginning with Roman law and looking at the Roman influence on the English legal system. I believe it's about 3 or 4 lessons. About 2 or 3 lessons looking at the influence of Roman Britain. And essentially what we're going to do is look a little bit at the historical foundations of the English legal system prior to the Norman conquest, beginning with this idea of the Roman law. And remember, this first half of lessons is going to be we're going to be concerning ourselves almost exclusively with the development of the common law, because the development of the common law sort of takes some foundations in the Roman period and then more importantly in the Anglo-Saxon period. And then as time goes on through the Norman conquests, and then eventually when we get to the sort of Angevin Empire, we get to see the development of the common law more succinctly. And then as time goes on, we will start to think about the influence and the role of Parliament as Parliament starts to develop and take on a greater and greater role within the English legal system. This lesson is going to explore the historical context of Roman Britain. We'll talk about the specific legal traditions that the Roman law influences over the next couple of lessons. We'll talk a little bit about the Roman law in this video as well. But I want to begin by just talking about Roman Britain. Okay, Roman Britain from around 43 AD to 410. Influence on the development of the common law is subject to quite a lot of interesting insight, specifically when we're thinking about the extensive legal legacy that the Roman Empire left. You have to think the majority of the civil law across most of Europe dates its origins to the Roman Empire and to the Roman legal system. And just like how the Romans exported things like Christianity across most of Europe, they so too also exported a lot of legal traditions across many parts of Europe. And now, the reason why we're going to be spending more of our time focusing on Anglo-Saxon influences over the development of the common law and not as much time looking at the Roman law specifically is because the Roman law didn't directly form the basis of the English common law, unlike the direct principles that we see in the majority of the civil law traditions in Europe, the Roman law didn't sort of take hold and capture the kind of foundations that it did across Europe. Okay, that doesn't mean there was no influence whatsoever. There are still little bits of influence that we can see when looking at the Roman law and the influence of Roman law on the English legal system. But for the most part, we can't see necessarily a clear connection from the common law, from the Roman law to the common law, if that makes sense. There are like little bits of influence, but it didn't take hold in the same kind of way that the Roman law did across in Europe. So let's just think about the Roman legal system.
But yet,
in
all of our
Britain.
current laws in America
Roman
are
law
going
generally
towards
was
Roman law.
formalized and a codified system. Okay, this is a really important point. We will study Roman law in the future as its own separate series of lessons. But one of the things that we see was that the Roman law was primarily used to govern Roman citizens and soldiers that were stationed in Britain. Okay, so in the same way that they would control Roman citizens across other parts of Europe, they also would control parts of Britain. The provinces of the empire, including Britain, operated under a dual system of legal tradition. You have firstly the Roman civil law, okay, and the Roman civil law would apply to Roman citizens. It included things like property laws, personal rights, contracts as well. You also then have the provincial Roman law. The provincial Roman law would apply to the native population.
So think of it as like a TV ad with a catalog component where I can choose on the Roku app and immediately it's going to send me a text that comes from Roku and it just...
Hold on.
So the system of law that was applicable when the Romans had control of Britain was a system of law which was divided among the civil tradition, the civil law itself, which applied to Roman citizens that were stationed in Britain, and then the provincial law, which would apply to native populations. This was a little bit less codified, a little bit less formalized, and that's one of the reasons why, when the Romans eventually leave Britain and we start to see the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons start to colonize and start to take hold of the British Isles, we see that the Roman law itself that did not survive in the same kind of way that it did in places like across Europe and whatnot. So essentially, the presence of Roman law in Britain did bring about more organized governance, and of course brought about legal systems in certain areas in the same kind of way that it did across a lot of the Roman Empire. Towns had Roman-style courts. They handled legal disputes. They had Roman magistrates that administered justice according to the basic principles of Roman law. But for the most part, and for the majority of the native population, particularly when it comes to rural areas, which was the vast majority of Britain at the time, there was just the following of local customary laws. So the Roman law didn't really have the kind of in-depth influence over the majority of the population, the majority of the native population. During the Roman occupation, several important legal concepts were still nevertheless introduced. So the Roman law was codified. It was written down, unlike the sort of customary laws and traditions that existed within the rural areas of English society. A significant shift we see, obviously, from the sort of oral customary law of the native Britons. The Roman system of courts and legal officials, such as judges and magistrates, would eventually come to influence the development of a more formalized legal institution in Britain. So that's one of the things that we can sort of take from the Roman legal system as being influential from all the way back in the history of English law. Roman property law also was quite influential, including things like the idea of dominium, brought about more structured land tenure systems. And the Roman practice of issuing land titles and legalized transactions also helped influence land laws even after the Romans withdrew. So, as I mentioned at the start of this lesson, the common law wasn't a direct descendant from a Roman legal system that sort of stayed and has quite a lot of significant influences. But you can still nevertheless see some significant influences that remains even to this day within the sort of English legal system that comes
Yeah,
from the
because the
Roman
Jews
tradition and from the
actually
Roman
showed
legal
law to
concepts.
the
And
world,
that makes sense given the sort
and
of
the
400
Romans
years of
adopted
occupation
those parts.
that we see within Roman Britain. But it is really when the Romans leave and we see the Angles and the Saxons take over that we start to see a true codification of the English legal systems. But even in that sense, the inflection point of the Norman conquests leads to another set of developments of legal principles and legal systems with things like feudalism and the development of such a system in that regard. So essentially what we can conclude is that the English legal system is something of an amalgamation of all of these different prior systems that existed, taking little bits from each one and developing it and making alternative points, making alternative reforms and making alternative little changes here and there. And this has certain influence in terms of why we should study the English legal system and why we should study the Roman law and the influence of Anglo-Saxon law. But it is quite unique compared to that of, for example, the United States, that has a significant point at which a legal system develops, which is, of course, with the American Revolution and the establishment of the Constitution. And the similar thing can happen. We can see when we look at the revolutions in Europe. And this is one of the reasons, in fact, why we don't have a constitution, whereas places like France and Germany and the United States do have a sort of codified constitution compared to ours, because our history is very different. And that's one of the things that I want to sort of just keep on drilling into people when we are thinking about this study of history and this study of legal history in future lessons time.
Ever dreamed of leaving the ground level life behind? At U.S. Aviation Academy, your first takeoff happens.
In this lesson, in this final lesson, looking at the influence of the Roman law on the development of the English legal system. In this lesson, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the influence and, more importantly, the legacy of the Roman legal system on the English legal system and the sort of influence that was left when the Romans eventually leave Britain in 410 AD. We'll talk about the things that didn't remain, things that didn't stay as part of the sort of the withdrawal of the Romans generally, and the collapse of the Roman legal system there. But then we will talk about some of the things that did remain. Okay, and some of these things aren't strictly legal, but then sort of morph into and have legal influences that you can still trace back to the Romans. And that's why it's very important that we do this area of study. We'll spend some more time essentially looking at the Roman law and the influence that the Roman law has on the English legal system, bearing in mind that when we are talking about the development of the common law, we're only really going to be seeing this start to take shape more and more and more and more and more when we start looking at the post-Norman conquest and we start looking at Henry II, for example. So the Anglo-Saxon system and the Roman law system provides something of a sort of precursor to the ways in which legal systems start to develop. Whereas, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, the English legal system, if you study its history, is a study of various different institutions, various different legal systems, from the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, to the sort of to the Norman conquest, and then the development into that all have taken, and that all have different bits that remain and bits that eventually get thrown by the wayside, and there are bits that come back and get revived, and all this kind of thing. So it's like a strange mixing pot, a strange amalgamation of a variety of different legal principles, given the fact that there was a variety of different peoples who essentially lived in Britain and occupied Britain and basically controlled Britain. So we're going to talk in this lesson about the Roman law traditions that left, that remained, should I say, when the Romans left in 410 AD. And this really speaks more to the legacy of the Roman law. So the point that we can make straight away is that when the Roman legions did leave Britain in 410 AD, much of the Roman administrative and legal structures would collapse, and we see the collapsing of those institutions. And so what follows is the sort of Anglo-Saxon period, and what they essentially implemented within their system, we'll get to in more detail in future lessons, but they generally implemented, should I say, a reversion of localized customary laws. But there were still, nevertheless, certain Roman legal practices which would persist. And this makes sense given that for nearly 400 years, the Romans controlled much of Britain. And we noted in the previous lesson that one of the things that the Romans, or at least the Roman law, didn't do was penetrate all the way to every single facet of Britain. So, for example, they didn't they didn't essentially have the kind of structured administrative procedures that existed under the Roman law in all parts of the country, like places where there are rural farming and all that kind of parts. Those still remained very much using oral customary practices to operate their legal systems, essentially. So the Anglo-Saxons basically reverted back to this system, a system that existed prior to the Romans, but they still nevertheless allowed for and continued the practice of certain legal principles that did derive from the Romans. So in urban areas, specifically within towns and communities, there was, for example, the use of Latin, the continued use of Latin, and the preservation of Roman legal texts.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it, just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44.
Another thing that's important to note is that despite the collapse of the Romans' political control, certain administrative and legal institutions, such as the use of written documentation, did survive in some form. And this was in two particular contexts specifically. So within the church, within religious institutions, and also within commercial contexts. And this is one of the things that I wanted to mention when thinking about the legacy of the Roman law and the legacy that was left on the English legal system. And that's the influence of religion. The Romans, as I mentioned, exported Christianity across the empire. And the reason why that's so important is Christianity and the Christian church, the Catholic Church, begins to develop its own legal system. Okay, this becomes known as canon law. And the canon law would operate its own legal system where they would where they would almost run alongside certain legal systems that existed in Europe and existed in Britain. And so that's one of the most powerful institutions that was left after the Roman withdrawal. And even though it's not directly to do with the law, the Christian church, it develops into its own legal system, and its own legal system that heavily influences the legal system that we see in the Anglo-Saxon period and that we see in the post-Norman conquests. And so the church maintained a legal system that was influenced by Roman principles, things like the ecclesiastical legal tradition that would eventually have a strong influence on the development of law in medieval England. Another thing that should be noted and that's very important is the rediscovery of various principles. So the more profound and direct Roman influence on the common law would come during the 12th century and later, as Roman law was rediscovered and studied more in medieval Europe, just like how when we see the rediscovery of some of the classical philosophers within the world of ancient Greece, people like Aristotle and Plato sort of gets rediscovered, and that then gets sort of morphed into and wrapped up in the Christian doctrines of medieval Europe. And also, if we think about the Islamic Golden Age, a similar thing happens where we see the sort of ancient Greek philosophers start to be amalgamated into Islamic philosophy and into Christian philosophy. The period that I'm mentioning here saw the rise of universities, particularly in places like Italy and France, where Roman legal texts were studied. So people like Emperor Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis was studied, it was analyzed, it was taught as a part of an emerging field of legal scholarship. This was compiled, the Corpus Juris Civilis, in the 6th century by Justinian I, the Byzantine emperor, and was codified. Was a codification, should I say, of centuries of Roman legal thought. One of the things I want to just quickly mention for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, but the Roman Empire sort of exists in two distinct parts. You sort of have the Roman Empire in the West, which is the sort of Roman Empire that we know of, and that we think about. But then we see a shift of the Roman Empire moving all the way to the east, the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes known as the Byzantine Empire or Byzantium. This carries on until the sort of mid 1400s, when it is taken over by the Ottomans. It was Emperor Constantine that founds Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. And so the Roman influence goes all the way up until the 1400s, and that's why you can see and understand that the Roman law is still very influential in Europe, especially to this day. The collection of Roman laws that we see in the Corpus Juris Civilis, particularly legal principles and scholarly commentary, have a significant impact on the development of legal systems across the Middle Ages. And that's where we get the civil law. For many European countries, France, Spain, Italy, there is legal systems that are adopted on the basis of the Roman civil law. This tradition sees a number of things, okay? So the codification of laws, written statutes, the application of general legal principles. And although England did not adopt the civil law, the Roman civil law, as fully as other parts of Europe, this is still important when we think about the study of Roman legal traditions and the development of English legal scholarship. Legal scholars in England would study the Roman law as a way to sort of integrate their understanding of the common law. And this is one of the things that's quite interesting. We see a quite significant division between the civil law traditions of the continental European countries, places like France, Spain, and Italy, and the sort of common law traditions of England and Wales. And this distinction is based partly on history. It's based partly on the fact that England has a very different history to that of the majority of the rest of England. The rest of Europe, should I say? But it's also partly due to the fact that the Romans were much more heavily entrenched in continental Europe than they were in Britain. They were sort of expedition in Britain, and then for the most part, the Romans would situate would spend most of their time in continental Europe, and would remain as part of continental Europe all the way up until the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the collapse of Constantinople to the Ottomans, all the way up into the 1400s. So that's another reason why we think about the Roman law in relation to our studies of the history of the English legal system. Now, as I've mentioned in the previous lesson, and as I will continue to mention when thinking about the influence of the Roman law, this first chapter talking about the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons, okay, is supposed to be a sort of preliminary foundational understanding of these two kinds of systems that, while didn't directly translate into post-Norman conquest and directly translate into the creation of the common law under Henry II, still influenced to a great extent a number of different parts of the legal system that we know of today.
You built the business you dreamed of, but now it feels like it's running your life instead of the other way around. I remember
in this final lesson, looking at the influence of the Roman law on the development of the English legal system, I just want to think a little bit about the kind of things that are sort of left as a result of the Roman law and that still influences the common law to this very day. And this is including not only just legal principles or legal institutions, but just things like special words, specific words to describe specific things that sort of date back to the Roman law traditions. And this is just to sort of tie up all the things that we have been speaking about over the last few lessons, looking at the way in which the Roman law has been able to slowly develop into what we see today with the common law, and just to really reiterate the point that I made very early on, that we have a number of different layers of ideas, if you will, when it comes to sort of the kinds of things that the Roman law brought to the English legal system, the kind of things that the sort of Anglo-Saxons brings to the English legal system, and then when we start to think about the ways in which the English legal system starts to develop even more and more into the creation of the common law as we know it under Henry II. So again, mentioning it very, very clearly, we know that while the common law, the English common law, remained distinct from Roman law for since the Romans left essentially in 410 AD, several key Roman legal concepts and methods still influences its development, particularly when we think about the 12th century and beyond. We'll look at these principles in this lesson in more detail. So, let's begin first by thinking about legal procedures which were influenced by the Roman law. Well, the Roman law provided, as we know, a model for structured legal procedures and formalized judicial processes. Although the common law courts developed their own procedures and have their own influences from a variety of different places, this still nevertheless includes the Roman law. They were influenced by the Roman approaches to things like adjudication, especially when it comes to an emphasis that is placed on the nature of reasoned judgment, as well as the separation of legal issues into distinct questions. This is a kind of conceptual idea and a conceptual analysis that is not necessarily specific legal principles, but is still nevertheless an important part, an important aspect of the creation of and the development of the Roman legal system. Now, many legal terms and concepts in the English law were derived from the Roman law, which is another area in which we can think about the creation of or the development of the development of the English legal system and the way in which the Roman law comes at that approach. So the Roman concept of persona, for example, the idea of a legal person, is influences the development of ideas about legal capacity in English law. The idea of stare decisis, okay, is a Roman legal principle that translates from Latin to mean to stand by things decided. While developed in the common law as its own separate principle, it still nevertheless bears a quite significant resemblance to the Roman practice of respecting precedent and constituent rulings. Remember, for those of you who have studied the English legal system and have studied the way in which the English legal system operates, one of the things that's important is this idea of stare decisis. And it's something that is exported across a lot of the common law world. Stare decisis is an important part of, for example, the legal system in the United States. And so all of these things derive from the basic principle in law, the basic principle in Roman law, to stand by things decided. The idea of the law of obligations, which is an area of English law which concerns things like contracts, consensual agreements, sales, and loans, for example, all begin their life and were influenced by the Roman law itself. Formation of contract law in England through common law, we see it take more
What does that say? The
case-based
idea of
approach to contractual
contracts and
disputes.
obligations?
The stories are true. The facts are clear. Read the Faraday Twins. Discover what and why big pharma companies don't.
Another area where we see quite a significant amount of influence is when we look at the legacy of property law from the Roman law tradition. Roman law had a significant influence over the way in which property was adjudicated. The Roman concept, for example, of dominium, which referred to the absolute ownership of property, helped to shape the nature of a variety of different English land law traditions.
Isn't what Jesus did on the cross to restore dominion?
Such as, for example, the nature of land ownership, the idea of tenure, and the nature of transfer. In addition to this, we see the Roman distinction between real property, i.e. realty and land, and personal property, i.e. movable goods, becoming an integral part of English property law. For those of you who haven't studied our lesson on land law, our lessons, should I say, plural, on land law, you'll notice that this is a similarity that we can see between these different principles as well. Another very important part of the English legal system that we will spend time thinking about on its own is also this principle of equity, the idea of equity, beginning within the Roman law. Again, the Roman law included the concept of what was known as equitas, or equity, which emphasized the nature of fairness and the nature of justice within legal decisions. This development leads to the influence of, and the influence by, sorry, the English Court of Chancery. The English Court of Chancery was a system of law which would essentially provide remedies that were in equity that the common law did not. So in situations where the common law was seen as particularly rigid and particularly unjust in the application, where the application of the common law is still correct, but it still nevertheless is quite unjust, the Court of Chancery can step in and apply principles of equity that would emphasize fairness and justice. We then see in the 1870s the Judicature Act, which sort of merges the courts of Chancery with the rest of the common law, and merges the common law and the law of equity together. But for the majority of the English legal system, you have a sort of duality that exists between the Court of Chancery on the one hand and the courts of the common law on the other. And there are various instances and situations where these actually clash with each other in a variety of different ways. So this is another example of how this actually operates. Furthermore, the Roman natural law theory, from a jurisprudential standpoint, which suggested that law should be based on reason and universal principles of justice, would eventually start to influence English legal philosophy. So not only from the actual strict application of the law, but also when it comes to the ways in which jurisprudence was operated and legal philosophy was sort of developed as well. And of course, natural law theory takes a lot of inspiration as well subsequently, when we think also about the nature of the nature of Christianity and the influence of religion and Christianity in relation to that as well. So even though I've been saying for the past sort of like 4 or 5 lessons that the Roman law has little hints of influence over the English legal system, there are still nevertheless very important principles that have their origins in Roman traditions that you should still be familiar with when we start to now move on and think about the ways in which we see the development of the Anglo-Saxon legal system, which we're going to spend even more time thinking about in future lessons.
We're Phoenix Energy, a family-owned oil company focused on unleashing American oil from North Dakota. And
welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the history of English law. This lesson is going to be moving on to looking at the next major theme that emerges out of the English legal system prior to the Norman conquest. And this is prior to anything that we could generally consider to be England. In fact, it is under the Anglo-Saxons that we see the establishment of what becomes known as England, which we'll get to in future lessons' time. But fundamentally, this is the second sort of period of history that is prior to the Norman conquest, but is still nevertheless important for the development of the English legal system. And this is the legal system of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, generally speaking, the Anglo-Saxon period and the legal system of the Anglo-Saxon period is the sort of legal system that emerges in the early 5th century AD after the collapse of the Roman rule in Britain. So the Romans essentially leave, and we see this sort of period from the 5th century AD all the way up to 1066, when we see the Norman conquest and the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon period. It would evolve as a legal system over a number of centuries, and it was based on a number of local customs, traditions, and the combination of a kind of Germanic tribal law with, as we will later see in the sort of 6th century, the establishment and the incorporation of Christian principles as well. And there are obviously different periods from the 5th century all the way up to 1066. It's a period of around 500 or so years. And there are very key figures within each of these different centuries in this different period. So, for example, we will talk in a future lesson about Alfred the Great. We will talk about Edward the Elder, Alfred the Great's son, and then Athelstan, who obviously becomes the person who is responsible fundamentally for the establishment of what we become known as the United England that we see today. Prior to Athelstan and under Alfred the Great, you see the existence of what is known as the Heptarchy. This is a period of time in which you have a number of kingdoms within England that are all sort of divided, and then you have the influence, of course, of the Vikings, who that land in Lindisfarne in around the 700 AD, should I say, the 7th century AD. And we'll see all of this take place, and we'll see how all of this sort of incorporates into each other, and we sort of see how this develops into a legal system that we know of today. The Anglo-Saxon legal system, in terms of sort of broad characteristics that we can think about it, was unique for its reliance on customary law. It was unique for its reliance on unwritten laws that were based on tradition and sort of passed down through word of mouth. This was an emphasis on compensation as well, rather than, for example, punishment for crimes, something that, again, we will look at in future lessons. I just want to finish this video then by thinking about a variety of different sources of Anglo-Saxon law, where Anglo-Saxon legal systems and legal traditions come from. And one such example is something that we've already just touched on, the idea of customs and local practices. And it is definitely true that the idea of customs and local practices formed the bedrock of the Anglo-Saxon legal system. They were not written down initially, but were passed on orally within communities. So the early Anglo-Saxon period, so the 5th century going all the way to maybe around the 7th or 8th century, we see a consistent practice of passing orally through communities these different local customs and local practices of Anglo-Saxon law. It is only with the writing of substantial law codes and the writing down of a variety of different things that we start to see the establishment of more written sources for the Anglo-Saxon legal system. These customs would also vary from region to region among the Heptarchy, so they would reflect the variety of different tribunal origins of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So the sort of 3 major kingdoms within the Heptarchy were Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria. And generally speaking, these would have become united eventually into an England that we know of, and this would take place sort of foundationally beginning under people like Alfred the Great, who sort of saw a sort of vision of a united England, and then we see more substantially under his grandson, King Athelstan, the establishment of a more united England as well. And so you can't really think about the Anglo-Saxon period and the Anglo-Saxon legal system specifically without reference to the monarchies that existed and the nature of kingship, the nature of monarchy during this period of time. As these Anglo-Saxons, as these kingdoms became more and more centralized and they began to become more and more institutionalized and more sophisticated in the establishment of law and order, the kings would start to issue what were known as law codes. These law codes did not necessarily seek to replace any of the principles of customary law, but rather to try and supplement it instead, especially when we think about areas related to things like public order and criminal justice and the protection of royal interests. Now, public order, I'm using a sort of modern conception of the term public order, but things that you would generally consider to be public order based legal systems is what I'm talking about in relation to this. Of course, public order as a phrase is something that's a lot more modern and refers more to the sort of the police codes of practice that exist in the modern period of the United Kingdom. Now,
the story's worth everything. It's my legacy.
Storyworth is the gift of your loved one's stories.
This is such a cool way to give our kids a memoir of our lives.
Capture all their stories in a book the whole family will treasure.
The process itself I was really happy with. It was really easy.
It was such a fun project to do.
Each week, we'll email them a question about their life. They just write back with their stories.
I enjoyed receiving a question a week for the
past year reflecting on my childhood and past experiences.
And with Storyworth, your loved one's stories are in their words, not someone else's.
Everybody should have a time in their life to write such a story about themselves.
You can also add beautiful color pictures to complement each story.
This is a book that my kids, my grandkids, and future generations will treasure.
And then we'll print them in the highest quality, so your book will live on for generations.
I can't wait to share my stories with my friends and family.
It's absolutely one of the greatest gifts you could give somebody.
That is so sweet. The best gift ever.
Because everyone has a story worth sharing. Get started today with instant delivery.
As I noted, it was the sort of 2nd century of the Anglo-Saxon period that we see the establishment of Anglo-Saxon law codes. At least the earliest surviving Anglo-Saxon law code is that of King Ethelbert of Kent, which was around circa 602 AD. Now, this was a law code that also was influenced by the introduction of Christianity into the region as well. And we'll get into on the next slide looking at the influence of the church and Christianity. But it is considered itself, the law code of King Ethelbert of Kent, is considered to be one of the oldest written laws in English history. And more law codes will be established, some of which will become more influential and more impactful than others. But at least the very earliest surviving law code is that of King Ethelbert of Kent. We may have evidence to suggest that there are law codes that may have existed prior to this particular one, but at least in terms of the ones that we have and that we can actually look at and that we can see, this is the earliest one that we have. And so finally then, thinking about the variety of different sources of the Anglo-Saxon legal system, we can think about the influence of the church. The Christianization of England begins in around the 6th century and into the 7th century, and the church, as a result of this Christianization of England, becomes a very influential institution within the English legal system. And so church law, sometimes described as canon law, addressed a number of very important moral and spiritual matters. So things relating to and influencing inheritance, morality issues, and marriage all were sort of wrapped into the sort of body of canon law that existed. In addition to this, laws that had any kind of moral dimension, and in some cases, a lot of laws had quite a significant amount of moral dimension. You would see that there was either the direct addressal by the church, by church law, or at least the influence of church law. The church would play an important role, therefore, in things like the administration of justice, especially when you think about the establishment of what become known as ecclesiastical courts. In addition to this, at the local level, law was often administered by assemblies known as moots or folk courts. And so these were considered to be gatherings of freemen who would come together and adjudicate disputes in the enforcement of the customary law, usually local landholders. And so thinking early about this period of the Anglo-Saxons, it's not correct necessarily to sort of tarnish or at least to sort of paint a broad brush about Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, because the Anglo-Saxons definitely developed and become more sophisticated and more institutionalized as time goes on. But at least in this early period, the sort of 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, you see at least the very clear amount of common customary laws that are established, and the way in which these customary laws were passed from person to person were very much through word of mouth, rather than necessarily being written down and established in a more institutional format. You also have to think about the fact that there was a certain degree of fragmentation, given that we're not actually talking at this period of time about England as it exists today, or England as it exists after the Norman conquest, for example. We're talking about a variety of England that is divided among a system of different kingdoms. You've got Wessex, Northumbria, and all these different kinds of systems. And so you have to think about it not necessarily as a united England, even though we sort of generalize the Anglo-Saxon period as being described as Anglo-Saxon England. That's not exactly how the Anglo-Saxons at the time saw their allegiance to a particular kingdom. They would see themselves as being allegiant to Wessex or to Northumbria, for example, or any other kingdom within the Heptarchy. We do get a more united England as time goes on, especially when we see the influence of the Vikings and the establishment of Daneland and the Danelaw as well. But at least at this early period, we don't have this clearly united system of England in the same kind of way, despite the fact that, of course, historians and people who write books on the history of England sort of just describe this colloquially as Anglo-Saxon England.
When you write, your tone influences how readers respond. With Grammarly, just highlight your text and type how you want to sound. Get your message right every time. Download it for free at Grammarly.com.
As you can tell, I was not created by GoDaddy Aero. It uses AI to create great-looking, totally pro logos in minutes. Like him. Now that's a horse. Me? Ugh. I look like a two-legged dog. A dog horse. I'm a horse, man, who needs some dental work. Logo that actually looks like a horse. Imagine that. I can't even name right.
Welcome back, everybody, to our studies of the English legal system in terms of its history, the history of English law. This lesson is going to be continuing thinking about the discussion as it relates to the Anglo-Saxon legal system, looking at some of the more specific elements of the Anglo-Saxon legal system, examining the specificities, looking at some of the key features, the features that were seen to be sort of unique to the Anglo-Saxon legal system, but also bearing in mind and keeping sort of in the back of our minds, or keeping one eye on the idea that as time goes on, there is a greater and greater influence of Christianity in relation to the administration of justice, the establishment of legal order, and the ways in which the legal system essentially is framed, not only from the sort of down-to-earth practical considerations, but even from the more theological, philosophical elements of the system of justice. And thinking about justice philosophically requires you to essentially take into consideration the impact of Christianity and sort of divine metaphysics and all these different kinds of things. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't really know what you mean by this, but I will get to that as we go on in these lessons. I'm thinking about a specific feature of not only Anglo-Saxon legal systems, but also the sort of medieval legal systems as well. But we will get to that in future lessons time, and towards the end of this lesson, in fact, as well. So one of the key features of the Anglo-Saxon legal system is the fact that the law itself was very, very customary in nature. It was primarily based on customs that were not written down and were passed by word of mouth and sort of practiced by local communities. This is true, especially in the early periods. We know that the Anglo-Saxon period sort of begins where, as the Romans embark away from their occupation of Britain, and we sort of see from around the 5th century AD, the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon period. There was an emphasis on local traditions, and that these local traditions were useful for the resolution of disputes through a variety of communal gatherings, rather than necessarily having a structured, institutionalized, and formalized process of legal adjudication. By contrast, of course, this is very different to the modern legal systems that we see today. We don't have a CPS in the Anglo-Saxon system. We don't have Parliament in the Anglo-Saxon system. The only thing that we do have that has any kind of reference to the Anglo-Saxon legal system is the fact that we still have monarchy, even though our monarchy is very severely limited compared to that of the kings of the Anglo-Saxons. And so, by contrast to these modern legal systems, the Anglo-Saxon legal system was highly personalized. Justice was not administered by the state. There was no such thing as the state. There were kingdoms, but the idea of the state didn't exist at this time. The idea of a united England for the majority of Anglo-Saxon period also didn't exist either. And so you don't have justice administered by the state. You have justice that is administered by local communities. Disputes were often resolved not through the administration of justice by some centralized body or authority. They were often resolved through negotiation, compensation, and communal decision making. And so within this sort of broader conceptualization, the idea of the family and local kinship groups played a very central role in the ways in which justice, the sort of Anglo-Saxon early Christian conception of justice, was enforced and administered.
The health impacts of phthalates are alarming. Anything in plastic. Phthalates continue to leach over time. Even bottled water. Eliminate them. Use your tap water with the John Ellis E5 water machine. It's not a filter. This patented method boils and cools water, producing low steam pressure that stops the pollutant carryover, then hits the steam with powerful UV light, producing the pure in the industry, improving blood flow. Don't take chances, especially pregnant women and children. Find out more about the John Ellis E5 water machine at 845-754-8696.
Okay, if there's one AI site builder you need to meet, it's this dope tech from Wix. Now, this whole flow is a conversation, so your words actually build your website. I'm going for a store, and after a free-flowing conversation, I get this detailed site brief. And just like that, my first draft is ready. Now, that's dope. Next, you can really get in there and style it your way. Here's the fun part. You can regenerate this whole thing over and over, or you can tweak something specific, like your layout. Let me describe what I had in mind. Yeah, that's fire. If there was ever a time to speak life into your dreams, it's right now using the Wix AI website builder.
And one such example of how this took place, an example that you might know of if you know anything about anything colloquial about the nature of the Anglo-Saxon period, is something known as the weregild. A weregild was an emphasis essentially on compensation over any kind of punitive measure when it came to the administration of justice. And so the weregild represents that nature of compensation. Rather than imprisonment, rather than corporal punishment, offenders and people who had acted unjustly or acted immorally were typically required to just compensate their victims, or to compensate the families of the victims who had been wronged in some kind of way. This is what the weregild essentially was. It becomes known as the weregild, a system of compensation that is central to Anglo-Saxon justice. Simply, it was a system whereby you would have fines that were paid by the offender to the victim or the victim's family. That's essentially it. Weregild is translated literally to meaning man price. And so the amount of the weregild would be determined on the basis of the social status of the victim. So, for example, the killing of a nobleman or a member of the clergy would present itself with a much higher weregild than that of the killing of an individual commoner or a peasant, for example. So the weregild was a system that essentially sought the administration of justice as a sort of sense of balance, a sort of sense of compensation. If you think to your studies of the law of tort, the principle of compensation sort of dates back, if you will, to all the way, thinking all the way back to this idea of the weregild, the idea of balancing the scales by acting in a wrong way, by acting immorally against another individual. You have presented an imbalance in the scales, and the weregild is designed to essentially rebalance the scales by paying off and to compensate an individual for their wrongs, for the wrongs that have been committed against them. It was also a system that would try to help the prevention of what became known as blood feuds, feuds where essentially families would continue to fight against each other and kill more and more and more until there's essentially none of them left, or there's a decimation of a particular group of people. Families, instead of having to like go out and reap revenge and essentially establish a feud, would be compensated for their loss rather than trying to seek retribution. Now, evidence of the wereguilds exist very, very early on in the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, King Ethelbert of Kent's law code, which was around 602 AD, the earliest surviving piece of legal documentation that we have of the Anglo-Saxon period, specifically examines the exact wereguilds for various different injuries. So whereas the nature of the wereguild was particularly customary, at least early on, when we start to see the establishment of law codes, specifically Ethelbert of Kent's law code, as cited here, they become a lot more formalized. They become a lot more institutionalized in the sense that you have a specific required compensation for a specific crime. So cutting off a finger, breaking a tooth, killing another individual, all had specific wereguilds that were attached and associated with them. And so you sort of have quite a complex code of practice, which essentially gives you what the respected and what the required compensation would be for the particular grievance or particular wrong or injustice that you have committed.
Save time creating content and generate a high-quality clone of your voice with 11 Labs. Change the way you record podcasts, voiceovers, and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice-generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
So the wereguild was essential to try and prevent blood feuds within the Anglo-Saxon legal system, and to also create a semblance of law within this particular period of time. It's arguable that blood feuds are not really a way of resolving legal disputes, because if a person or a family was wrong, it was seen as attack on their honor, and so in situations where the wereguild would not be paid, where there would not be compensation, or if a wrong was particularly grievous and therefore compensation would not really suffice, then families would often engage in cycles of revenge killings, where you try and restore the honor of your particular family or your particular local community. This would be a system that would be attempts to be mitigated by formalizing compensation and establishing more formalized mechanisms for dispute resolution. And that's really where the legal system begins. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who would argue that a system of blood feuds, of cycles of revenge killings, was an example of a legal system. It was really the absence of a legal system that establishes the idea of the blood feuds. And so as a result, things like the wereguild and things like mechanisms of dispute resolution are the legal responses and the legal answers to the problem that was established by the sort of the lack of control existing among administration of justice, where injustice is committed or where injustice takes place, and there's no real mechanism for which you can resolve that injustice. You end up going through cycles of revenge killings. So as you can probably imagine, and as I've noted at various stages in this lesson and in the previous lesson, the concept of monarchy is central to the nature of the legal system as it develops in Anglo-Saxon England. It was organized, the Anglo-Saxon society would be organized around kingship groups. The family or kindred was responsible for the behavior of its members. If an individual had committed a crime, their kinship group would be expected to compensate their victims and help bring about a system of justice. This collective responsibility would foster social cohesion and would maintain order within the community. And at the highest level, of course, you have the centralized system. You have the monarch themselves, the person who is ruling over that particular kingdom. I want to finally touch on something that shows the kind of influence that Christianity will have over this particular period of time. And this is the idea of the trial by ordeal. Now, for those of you who follow our podcast on the Law Academy, you will know that we've done a video on the nature of the criminal trial and its historical development. And the trial by ordeal is one such example of the stages of development of a criminal trial. essentially where guilt or innocence could not be determined by witnesses or oaths. The Anglo-Saxon courts would often resort to a system known as the trial by ordeal. This is a form of divine justice. Essentially, they would have to undergo a physical trial, and their fate would be determined by God. And this would be given as and interpreted as a sign of divine will. Examples of a trial by ordeal would be things like being submerged in water or carrying a hot iron across a particular space of territory, essentially a few steps. And what would happen is you would then bandage up that the wound from carrying the hot iron, and if it heals, then you are seen as being innocent in the eyes of God, and so therefore you have not committed a particular offense. If it does not heal, if it gets infected, or if it doesn't heal within a particular period of time, then it is considered that this is God's divine will showing who is guilty and who is innocent of this particular wrong that has been committed, and so you will be punished accordingly for that particular offense. Of course, this is nonsense, as we will eventually see. The trial by ordeal does sort of phase out over time. Yeah, if you are to have survived a trial, an ordeal without any kind of serious injury, then you are considered to have been innocent, at least in the eyes of God. And so,
can you please just hear me out? No, all work management platforms are the same. Monday.com is the one you'll actually love to use. It lets you set up your workflows yourself. No admin, no long approval process. You're in charge. I don't have time to set up workflows. Monday also has a ton of templates you can choose from, so you can be up and running in no time. Sounds too good to be true. You know that llamas are biologically incapable of lying. You know what? I'm ready to fall in love again. Thanks, Talking Llama. Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
essentially what is important to realize here is the theological implications of the trial by ordeal, the theological interpretations here. Remember, the Christianization of England takes place during the Anglo-Saxon period as sort of Christianity would spread across the former Western Roman Empire, and of course it establishes its home in Rome and then also in Constantinople. And we see that what is being imbued within a sort of practical, down-to-earth legal system is the nature of the divine and the theological and the philosophical and the metaphysical, and rather than it necessarily being things relating to the sort of eyewitness testimony or the practical day-to-day realities of people's lives, you are starting to instead, where you cannot find answers in ordinary oaths or testimonies or witnesses, you are then instead starting to find answers in the divine, and hoping that the divine and that the metaphysical and the idea of God will show the way when we think about who may have committed whatever offense has taken place. Another method for determining the outcome of a dispute was something known as an oath taking. A person who is accused of a crime could swear an oath of innocence and have others swear on their behalf. The others were known as the oath helpers. If the required number of oath helpers, usually men of good standing, as is the case in all of these different kind of societies, class and sexism often were very prevalent in these societies. Essentially, if there was enough of these oath helpers that supported the accused, then you would find in the favor of that individual. Of course, the value of the oath varied depending on the social status and the individual making said oath themselves. And of course, this can be boiled down to essentially a popularity contest. If enough people of good enough standing were able to attest to your innocence, then you would likely be able to get away with whatever crime you have been accused of committing, whether or not you are innocent or not innocent. This was seen as a less of an ordeal compared to the trial by ordeal, as you can probably imagine. And it does make a lot of sense that the trial by ordeal, while lasting for quite a period of time during the medieval development of the common law, it doesn't last forever, and it gets phased out relatively quickly compared to other long-lasting systems as well. We'll get to that in more detail as we go on throughout the history. If you want to know more about the trial by ordeal, we talk about it on the Jurisprudence podcast. where we talk about the history of the English trial. This was a podcast episode that we did a few months ago. So go and have a look over there. And that also talks about not just the trial by ordeal, but a much longer historical Now that we have spent more and more time thinking about the nature of the Anglo-Saxon legal system and looking at some of the more conceptual ideas surrounding the Anglo-Saxon legal system, this video specifically is going to look at the structure of the Anglo-Saxon legal system. What did the legal system actually look like? How did it develop? And under some of the more important and prominent monarchs during the Anglo-Saxon period, how did it develop over time? So we're looking more at the institutional structure of the Anglo-Saxon legal system rather than necessarily thinking about the substantive law. So we're not talking necessarily about the legal concepts, we're talking about the systems that existed, the structural systems, the institutions, the courts, the groups, the law codes that essentially established all of these kinds of substantive legal principles. And I want to begin by thinking about the nature of the court system. So the thing that we have to remember is that, of course, this is not a unifying system of law that took place during the entire period of the Anglo-Saxon history. Of course, the Anglo-Saxon history took place over a good 500 or so years, and you have to remember that these court systems and the law code systems and all the other kinds of councils that we will see developed over time. So they didn't all begin like this. It all developed over time, of course. But generally speaking, throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, local justice would be administered through a number of different courts. These become known as folk moots or moot courts. These were assemblies of local freemen who would come together and they would settle disputes, they would do land allocations, and they would enforce the customary local laws that had been passed down and practiced within local communities for centuries. These moots were often held at a variety of levels, and they included the more substantive courts known as the Hundred Court and the Shire Court. The hundred itself was a geographic division within a particular shire or a county, and the court of the hundred court, dealt with local disputes, particularly relating to minor criminal cases or issues related to the allocation of land, the issues of inheritance, etc., etc., etc. They were presided over by somebody known as a reeve. A reeve was an official that was appointed by either the king or the local lord. Remember, this is not just the king of England, this is the king of whatever kingdom that we're thinking about within the heptarchy, either Wessex or Northumbria, for example, or any other of the parts of the heptarchy itself, or Mercia, for example.
We have got to the point where literally anybody can build a fully working app without knowing how to code. This is base for.
So bear that in mind, obviously, when thinking about this period of time. And so essentially the Hundred Court was named after the geographical division that it presided over. So the Hundred was the geographical division that was within a shire or a county, and the Court of the Hundred was the court of that particular geographical division. A shire court, on the other hand, was a slightly higher level court than that of the Court of 100. A shire court would operate at a higher level and dealt with more serious cases. It was presided over by somebody known as a shire reeve. Sometimes, eventually, that would become, as you can sort of hear when you think about the sort of linguistic development, that begins to shift into a sheriff, shire reeve, sheriff. You can sort of see how that word develops into the word sheriff. And so a shire reeve is an individual who would preside over the more serious cases at the shire court level. And again, like I said, eventually turns into a sheriff as the title. And also by somebody known as an ealdorman, which becomes who is a king who is appointed as an official for the shire. So you have an ealdorman and you have a shire reeve, and these are the individuals that sort of are appointed to this higher level court that deals with more serious cases. They were important for the enforcing of royal decrees, And they were important for the resolutions of disputes that didn't just affect individuals or very localized local communities, but instead would affect the much broader community itself, the community of the shire or the county, rather than the community with communities divided within that shire or county. At an even higher level, when we start to think about the king themselves, you have the Witan, something known as the Witan, otherwise translated into the Council of the Wise. The Witan was an assembly of noblemen and church leaders, and these were quite high up noblemen and church leaders, people who sort of sat in the upper echelons of the kingdom, and they would advise the king on matters of laws and governance. So we're talking less about the sort of local administration of justice here with the sort of Court of the Hundred and the Shire Court. We're talking now about the central administration of the kingdom. We're thinking about the Council of the Wise, the Witan, the establishment of a council that would advise the king, that would advise the individual who is in control of the kingdom. Although the Witan was primarily seen as a political body, of course, the distinction between law and politics is not exactly clear-cut during the Anglo-Saxon periods, it was still nevertheless seen as primarily a political body. It would also be important in terms of playing a role in the development of law, particularly when we start to see in the middle to later period of the Anglo-Saxon period, the establishment of the law codes, the royal law codes of the kings of that particular time. We'll talk about those in a second. So the calling of the Witan would be in the development of new legal treatise that would be created in the sense of law codes, but would also primarily operate as a political institution, a political body. The king would often seek the approval of the Witan when it comes to the issuance of new laws and when it comes to the administration of justice in the kingdom at the centralized level. Again, we're thinking not just about England, we're talking about the centralization of justice in the kingdoms of the Heptarchy. We're talking about the centralization of justice in Mercia, the Mercian Witan, for example, or the Wessex Witan or the Northumbrian Witan. Bear that in mind. Of course, this would develop into a more unified system as time goes on, but for now, that is what we are thinking about. And the Witan, as I just mentioned, was important for the establishment of the royal law codes. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became further and further consolidated over time, the kings would begin to issue law codes that would standardize the legal practices across their various different realms as they would take further and further parts of territory. These law codes were intended to not overrule the basic customary laws that existed at the local level, but they were intended to supplement those local customary laws, and they were intended to address issues of a variety of different natures. So, as I mentioned in an earlier video, things like criminal justice, property rights, and public order. The earliest of the law codes, as we already know, is that of King Ethelbert of Kent from around circa 602 AD. This is one of the earliest examples of a written law within Anglo-Saxon England. It focuses mainly on the establishment of the detailed weregild system that we looked at in the previous lesson. We noted that for injuries and homicides, the weregild system was established to essentially compensate whatever injury and whatever grievance had taken place. And we used examples of a loss of a finger, the breaking of a tooth, the breaking of a bone, the killing of an individual, and the established weregild that would be necessary to essentially compensate that particular injustice. One of the most important figures within Anglo-Saxon England is undoubtedly Alfred the Great, who was in control and lived from around 871 to 899 AD. And Alfred's law code is one of the most important as a result of that. He combined the earlier laws from different regions with a number of biblical principles in Christian ethics. So Alfred the Great was a devout Christian, at least when he came to the throne eventually. He was never seen as, at least historians don't necessarily see him as somebody who was always born to be a ruler and born to be a king. He was sort of probably not cut out for that kind of work, but nevertheless he found himself in the position of the King of Wessex. And so when we think about that, he was particularly devout. He was a particularly intellectual individual. From what we know, he was somebody who sort of strived to see greater amounts of intellectual and philosophical learning and theological learning during his reign and within sort of his sort of local area. And this was imbued in his establishment of his law code. His law code sought to unify the kingdom. It sought to establish a consistent legal framework based on justice and fairness. And so his law code is a very important source of not only a good understanding of this period of history and this period of legal history, but also seeing the shift and the sort of imbuing of Christian principles more and more and more into the legal system that we know of to this day.
Listen, paying $14.99 a month for a streaming app and $9.99 a month for a music app and $12.99 for a fitness app.
Finally, then, another example of a law code is that of King Canute from 1020 to 1023. King Canute ruled a vast North Sea empire, and this North Sea empire included England. And he would issue a comprehensive law code that would actually see a mixing of and an intermingling of not only the Anglo-Saxons, but also Danelaw and the Danish. And don't forget, of course, that sort of from around the 7th century onwards, you see the influence and the growth and establishment of the Vikings. The Vikings land in England. They first settled down in Lindisfarne. That's where they first established some kind of territory within this period of history. And the Danelaw, the establishment of Danelaw, which is the sort of not only the system that is described as the sort of legal administration of the Danish kingdom, but also the sort of territorial area of the British Isles that the Danes actually control. It becomes known as the Danelaw. And King Canute, later on in the Anglo-Saxon period, is somebody who is very much influential in the way that he developed an establishment of Anglo-Saxon and Danish legal traditions mixed together. Canute's laws sought to maintain order and to promote stability in what effectively is a multi-ethnic kingdom. What is effectively a kingdom that shares a distinction in terms specifically and most importantly of religious tradition. You sort of have the pagan beliefs and the pagan mythologies of the Danish with the sort of Norse mythology that they believed in. And then, of course, you have what is considered, quote unquote, the enlightened beliefs of Christianity. And this was a source of conflict among a variety of different Anglo-Saxon kings and Danish rulers that we see taking place throughout the sort of Viking invasions of England.
Nice. All right. So anyhow, we're getting into the whole, history of common law and why we need to go back to it rather than this Roman statutory law that we're dealing with in America. Corporatization law now. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to call it a day, and we'll pick this back up where we left off. Enjoy. God bless.